Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that Nazi Germany won World War II, not in some distant future, but right now, in 2026. Imagine the swastika flying over Washington, D.C., London reduced to ruins, and an entire generation of people who never knew freedom, democracy, or basic human rights. Imagine your grandparents speaking German, not by choice, but by force. Imagine history books that teach children the Third Reich was humanity's greatest achievement. Imagine a world map painted in the colors of fascist tyranny, stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals and beyond. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a paranoid fantasy. This is what could have happened if one single day went differently. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in human history, the moment when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. It succeeded, but barely. The margin between victory and catastrophic failure was razor-thin, dependent on weather, luck, deception, and the courage of thousands of young men who waded through bullets and bombs to secure a foothold on those blood-soaked beaches. Change a few variables, make a few different decisions, and that invasion fails. And if that invasion fails, everything changes. The entire trajectory of human civilization pivots on that single day. So buckle up, because over the next several minutes, we're going to explore what happens when D-Day fails, and I promise you, by the end of this documentary, you'll understand just how lucky we are to be living in the world we have, with all its problems and imperfections, rather than the nightmare that almost came to pass. Let's start by understanding what actually happened on D-Day and why it was so close to failure even in our timeline. June 6, 1944, Allied forces consisting primarily of American, British and Canadian troops launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The goal was to establish a beachhead on the Normandy coast, break through German defenses, and begin the liberation of Western Europe. Nearly 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel on that first day, landing on 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. They faced German fortifications, machine gun nests, artillery, mines, and beach obstacles designed to tear apart landing craft and shred infantry. The Germans had spent years building the Atlantic Wall, a system of coastal defenses meant to make any invasion impossible. On several of those beaches, particularly Omaha, the invasion came terrifyingly close to failing. American troops faced withering fire, took enormous casualties, and were pinned down on the beach for hours. Some commanders considered withdrawing, abandoning the assault as a lost cause. But through extraordinary courage and sacrifice, the troops gradually pushed forward, cleared the beaches, and secured a foothold. Within days, the Allies had established a strong presence in France. Within weeks, they were pushing inland. Within a year, they had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into Germany itself. The success of D-Day led directly to the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945. But what if it had failed? What specific factors could have caused failure, and what would have happened next? Let's explore several scenarios, each one plausible and historically grounded. First scenario, weather. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, made the decision to launch the invasion based on a narrow window of acceptable weather. The original date was June 5th, but storms forced a delay to June 6th. Meteorologists predicted a brief break in the weather that would allow the invasion to proceed. They were right, but barely. If the weather had been slightly worse, if the storms had continued just a few more hours, the invasion would have been postponed or attempted in impossible conditions. Landing craft could have been swamped, paratroopers scattered even more widely than they were, air support grounded, and naval bombardment ineffective. Troops landing in heavy seas would have been exhausted and seasick before even reaching the beaches. Easy targets for German defenders. Second scenario, German preparation. The success of D-Day depended heavily on Allied deception. Operation Fortitude convinced German High Command that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. German forces, including crucial panzer divisions, were held in reserve far from the actual landing sites. Hitler himself was asleep when the invasion began, and subordinates were afraid to wake him. By the time German armor could be mobilized and moved to Normandy, the Allies had established their beachhead. But what if German intelligence had been better? What if they had discovered the deception and correctly identified Normandy as the invasion site? What if panzer divisions had been positioned closer to the beaches, ready to counterattack immediately? The Allied troops struggling to get off those beaches would have been slaughtered by German tanks. Without room to maneuver, without proper anti-tank weapons deployed yet, they would have been pushed back into the sea. Third scenario, German reserves. Even with the element of surprise, if Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been at his headquarters instead of visiting his wife for her birthday, if he had been able to coordinate a faster German response, if commanders on the ground had been given more authority to act without Hitler's approval, the German counterattack could have come hours earlier. Those few hours made all the difference. Allied forces used them to consolidate their positions, bring up reinforcements, and establish supply lines. Take away those hours, and the invasion might have been crushed before it could gain momentum. Any of these scenarios, or a combination of them, could have led to the failure of D-Day. So let's imagine it happens. Let's say that on June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy fails catastrophically. Allied forces suffer massive casualties, fail to establish a viable beachhead, and are forced to withdraw across the English Channel. Thousands of troops are killed, wounded, or captured. Vast amounts of equipment are lost or destroyed. The psychological impact is devastating. This was supposed to be the turning point, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and it failed. What happens next is where our alternate timeline truly diverges into darkness. First, the immediate military consequences. The failure of D-Day doesn't just delay the liberation of Western Europe. It potentially makes it impossible. You can't simply try again a few weeks or months later. The resources invested in Operation Overlord were enormous, accumulated over years of planning and preparation. The landing craft, the supplies, the trained troops, the element of surprise, all gone. Britain and the United States would need at least a year, probably more, to rebuild their forces and attempt another invasion. And the German defenders would now be expecting it, reinforcing the Atlantic Wall even further, positioning forces to respond to any landing site, and preparing new defensive measures based on what they learned from stopping the first invasion. But here's where it gets truly dark. Would there even be a second attempt? The political fallout from the failure would be immense. In the United States, public support for the war effort, already strained by years of fighting and sacrifice, could collapse. Imagine the newspapers reporting that thousands of American boys died on French beaches for nothing. Imagine the mothers receiving telegrams saying their sons were killed in an invasion that failed. Imagine the political opposition demanding to know why American lives were thrown away in a futile assault. President Franklin Roosevelt would face enormous pressure to focus on the Pacific War against Japan and negotiate some kind of settlement in Europe. Isolationist voices in Congress, never completely silenced even during the war, would grow louder, arguing that American boys shouldn't die for European problems. In Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill's government might fall. Churchill had staked everything on the invasion. Its failure could be seen as a catastrophic military blunder that wasted British and Commonwealth lives. Churchill might be replaced by someone more willing to negotiate with Germany, someone who sees continued fighting as pointless when the invasion everyone was counting on had failed so completely. Even if Churchill remained in power, British morale would be shattered. The British people had endured years of bombing, rationing and sacrifice, all sustained by the hope that eventually the tide would turn and they would liberate Europe. Take away that hope, and despair sets in. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union is still fighting Nazi Germany in a brutal war of annihilation. In our actual timeline, the success of D-Day forced Germany to fight on two fronts, dividing their forces and making it impossible to concentrate everything against the Soviets. But in our alternate timeline where D-Day failed, Germany can shift resources eastward. More divisions, more tanks, more aircraft can be sent to stop the Soviet advance. And here's something crucial. By mid-1944, Germany was beginning to field new weapons technology that could have changed the war if they'd had more time to develop and produce them. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was vastly superior to Allied propeller aircraft. The V-2 rocket, while not a war-winning weapon by itself, represented a technology that could be developed into something more devastating. German scientists were also working on more advanced tank designs, improved submarines, and other weapons. In our timeline, Germany didn't have time to produce these weapons in meaningful numbers before being overwhelmed by Allied advances from both East and West. But give Germany another year or two because D-Day failed and the Western Allies aren't advancing through France, and suddenly they have time to make those weapons operational in large numbers. Imagine the skies over Berlin, defended by hundreds of jet fighters that Allied bombers can't match. Imagine V-2 rockets, but more accurate and carrying larger warheads, or even the atomic warheads that German scientists were theoretically working toward. Germany would still be outmatched in resources by the combined Allied powers, but they might be able to make the war so costly and painful that their enemies lose the will to continue fighting. And this brings us to the most horrific aspect of our alternate timeline: time. Every additional month that World War II continues means more death, more destruction, and more time for the Nazi regime to carry out its genocidal agenda. In our actual timeline, the Holocaust was still ongoing when Allied forces liberated concentration camps in 1945. By then, approximately 6 million Jews had been murdered, along with millions of others including Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and Soviet prisoners of war. The Nazi death machine was running at full capacity until the very end. Now imagine it continues for another year or 2 years or longer. The numbers become almost incomprehensible. Every additional month of Nazi control means tens of thousands more people murdered in gas chambers, worked to death in labor camps, or killed in mass shootings. The longer the war continues, the closer the Nazis come to their goal of completely eradicating European Jewry. Let's think about the geopolitical situation that might develop if D-Day fails and the war drags on. By late 1944 and early 1945 in our alternate timeline, the Soviet Union is still advancing westward, but more slowly because Germany can concentrate more forces against them. The Red Army is taking horrific casualties, suffering the kind of losses that even Stalin's brutal regime finds difficult to sustain. At some point, the question becomes, can the Soviet Union defeat Germany alone? Stalin might conclude that it can't, or that the cost would be too high. Remember, the Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people in World War II in our timeline, an almost unimaginable sacrifice. If the war continues longer and Soviet casualties mount even higher, Stalin might decide he needs to negotiate. And here's where things get truly chilling. What if the Western Allies and the Soviet Union separately negotiate with Nazi Germany? What if we end up with a three-way peace settlement where Germany retains control of much of Eastern Europe? This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. Throughout the war, there were elements in both the West and the East who considered the possibility of a negotiated peace. If the war reaches a stalemate with Germany unable to defeat the Soviets, but the Soviets unable to defeat Germany, and with the Western allies unable or unwilling to invade Europe again, a negotiated settlement might seem like the only option to end the bloodshed. Imagine the terms of such a settlement. Germany might have to withdraw from Western Europe, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, returning those countries to some form of independence or Allied occupation. But in exchange, Germany retains control of Poland, large parts of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine and the Baltic states, and maintains puppet governments in places like Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia. The Holocaust might officially end, not because the Nazis suddenly develop a conscience, but because they've largely completed their genocidal project, and because ending it is a condition of peace. But Nazi racial ideology remains intact, meaning Jewish survivors have no home to return to, Romani people continue to face persecution, and Nazi Germany remains a brutally racist and authoritarian state, just one that's no longer actively at war. This is the best-case scenario in our alternate timeline, and it's still nightmarish. A world divided between Western democracies, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany, locked in a three-way Cold War. But there are worse possibilities. What if the Western Allies and the Soviet Union don't just negotiate separate pieces, but actually turn on each other? Remember, the alliance between the democratic West and the communist Soviet Union was always an alliance of convenience, held together by the mutual enemy of Nazi Germany. Remove that enemy or reduce the urgency of defeating it, and the alliance could fracture. Churchill was already worried about Soviet expansion even before the war ended. In our timeline, he gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, warning about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Imagine if, in our alternate timeline, Churchill and other Western leaders become so concerned about Soviet power that they consider the unthinkable, allying with Germany against the Soviet Union. This actually has historical precedent. As World War II was ending in our timeline, there were some in the West who proposed Operation Unthinkable, a plan to use defeated German forces to help attack the Soviet Union. The plan was rejected as insane, but in a timeline where Germany is not defeated and Soviet power looks even more threatening, such an alliance might seem less insane to desperate Western leaders. Imagine Nazi Germany surviving World War II as a recognized state, maintaining control of much of Central and Eastern Europe. The Nazi Party remains in power. The SS continues to exist. The concentration camps might be closed or repurposed, but the ideology that created them remains. Adolf Hitler, if he's still alive in this timeline, or his successor if he's died, rules over a German empire that stretches from the Rhine to deep into Russia. The swastika flies over Warsaw, Prague, and Kyiv, and the Western democracies have to treat this regime as a legitimate government, negotiate with it, trade with it, perhaps even ally with it against the Soviet Union. Now let's think about what this means for specific places and people. France and Western Europe might be liberated eventually through separate negotiations, but they would be traumatized and weakened. Years of additional Nazi occupation would mean more people sent to labor camps, more resistance fighters executed, more resources extracted, more cultural treasures destroyed or stolen. When liberation finally comes, these countries would be shells of their former selves, facing decades of reconstruction without the immediate American aid that the Marshall Plan provided in our timeline. Britain would survive, but would be bankrupted and exhausted. The bombing campaigns might continue longer. V-2 rockets and possibly jet bomber attacks would devastate British cities. The British Empire, already crumbling in our timeline, would collapse even faster as Britain lacks the resources to maintain it. India gains independence sooner and possibly in a more chaotic way. The Commonwealth fractures. Britain becomes a diminished power, traumatized by a war that lasted longer and ended ambiguously. The United States would emerge from this alternate World War II as a military and economic superpower, but one that's more isolationist and more cynical about foreign interventions. The failure of D-Day would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the limits of American power. There would be less willingness to take on global responsibilities, less faith in the idea that America should be the world's policeman. The Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Western Europe in our timeline, might not happen, or would be much smaller in scope. The United Nations might not be created, or would be a weaker organization. America might turn inward, focusing on domestic affairs and its own hemisphere, while leaving Europe to sort out its own problems. And what about the Soviet Union? If the war ends with Germany still controlling large parts of Eastern Europe, Stalin's regime would be paranoid and militarized to an even greater degree than in our timeline. The Soviet Union would be preparing for the next war, which it sees as inevitable. Stalin's purges might be even more extensive. The gulags would continue to operate at full capacity. Soviet society would be mobilized for permanent conflict. And here's the terrifying part. Both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would be racing to develop atomic weapons. In our timeline, the United States was first, dropping atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945. But in this alternate timeline, if the war drags on, Germany or the Soviet Union might develop atomic weapons, or the United States might use them against Germany instead of Japan. Imagine atomic bombs being used in Europe. Imagine Berlin or Moscow or London destroyed by nuclear fire. The psychological impact on humanity would be even more profound than in our timeline. The atomic age would begin not with an attack on a distant Pacific enemy, but with the nuclear annihilation of major European cities, perhaps multiple cities. The death toll could be in the millions. The radiation would poison vast areas, and once the nuclear threshold is crossed, it becomes easier to cross again. The post-war world would live under an even darker nuclear shadow than in our actual Cold War. Let's think about culture and ideas in this alternate timeline. In our world, the defeat of Nazi Germany discredited fascism and racist ideology, at least in their most extreme forms. The Holocaust became a universal symbol of human evil, a reminder of what happens when hatred and totalitarianism go unchecked. The post-war order was built on the idea that such things must never happen again. International human rights law developed as a response to Nazi atrocities. The phrase, "never again," became a rallying cry. Fascism and Nazism became politically toxic in most of the world. But in our alternate timeline, where Nazi Germany survives in some form, these ideas don't become discredited. Fascism remains a viable political ideology. Racism and anti-Semitism, while perhaps less openly genocidal, remain embedded in a powerful European state that the rest of the world has to deal with diplomatically. The idea of universal human rights develops more slowly or not at all, because how can you promote universal rights while recognizing the legitimacy of a government built on racial hierarchy? The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948 in our timeline as a direct response to Nazi atrocities, might never be created. Education and historical memory would be completely different. In our world, school children learn about World War II as a clear moral story. The Democratic Allies and the Soviet Union defeated the evil Nazi regime. We remember D-Day as a turning point, a moment of courage and sacrifice that led to the liberation of Europe. We visit Holocaust memorials and concentration camps to remember the victims and learn the lessons of history. But in the alternate timeline, the moral clarity is gone. How do you teach World War II to children when it ended in a negotiated stalemate? How do you remember D-Day when it failed? How do you commemorate the Holocaust when the regime that perpetrated it still exists? In Nazi-controlled territories, history would be rewritten entirely. Children would be taught that Germany fought a defensive war against Jewish Bolshevik aggression. They would learn that the concentration camps were necessary security measures. They would be indoctrinated with Nazi racial theory and would grow up believing that the Third Reich represents the natural order of human society. An entire generation would come of age having known nothing but fascist rule, unable to imagine alternatives, taught to see democracy as weak and racial hierarchy as natural. Now let's fast forward to the equivalent of our present day, 2026, in this alternate timeline. What would the world look like? It's difficult to say with certainty because so much would depend on specific events in the intervening decades, but we can sketch some possibilities. If Nazi Germany survived World War II, it might not still exist in 2026. Regimes, even brutal ones, eventually fall. The Soviet Union collapsed in our timeline despite surviving World War II victorious. Nazi Germany might follow a similar trajectory, collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, economic problems, or internal conflicts. But even if the Nazi regime fell sometime in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, its legacy would shape Europe and the world profoundly. The Cold War in this timeline would be a three-way struggle between the United States, the Soviet Union, and whatever remains of or succeeds the Nazi state. Nuclear weapons would proliferate faster. Space exploration might be more advanced because three powers are competing instead of two. Or it might be less advanced because resources are spread among more conflicts and no single program like the American space program gets the same level of support. Technology would develop differently, shaped by different priorities and different patterns of cooperation and competition. The European Union wouldn't exist, at least not in the form we know. In our timeline, the EU grew out of efforts to bind European nations together so they would never go to war with each other again. It was a project of reconciliation and integration founded on the ashes of World War II. But in the alternate timeline, Europe would still be divided by the scars of a war that never ended decisively. France, Germany, and other Western European nations might form some kind of alliance, but it would be motivated more by fear of external threats than by idealistic dreams of unity. Israel probably wouldn't exist or would exist in a very different form. In our timeline, the State of Israel was founded in 1948, driven partly by Zionist aspirations, but also by the international recognition that after the Holocaust, Jewish people needed a homeland where they could be safe. The state's creation was supported by many Western nations, feeling guilt and responsibility for the Holocaust. But in the alternate timeline, if Nazi Germany still exists or recently existed, and if the full extent of the Holocaust is less known or less acknowledged, support for creating Israel would be much weaker. Jewish survivors of the camps might have nowhere to go, scattered across the world, stateless and traumatized. The civil rights movement in the United States might develop differently. In our timeline, the moral clarity of World War II, the fight against racist Nazi ideology, helped energize the push for racial equality at home. How could America claim to have defeated racism abroad while maintaining segregation at home? This argument was powerful in the 1950s and 60s, but in a timeline where the war ended ambiguously and Nazi Germany survived, the moral argument is weaker. Racist ideologies would have more international legitimacy, which might embolden American racists and make the civil rights movement struggle harder and longer. Think about all the cultural touchstones that wouldn't exist. Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, countless other films and books about World War II and D-Day specifically, they either wouldn't exist or would tell very different stories. Instead of triumphant tales of Allied victory, you'd have tragic stories of sacrifice and failure. The greatest generation mythology that surrounds World War II veterans in America would be replaced by something more bitter and disillusioned. The veterans themselves would be haunted by failure rather than honored for victory. And on a personal level, countless people who exist in our timeline wouldn't exist in the alternate one. Soldiers who survived D-Day in our timeline would have been killed in the failed invasion. They wouldn't have come home, wouldn't have married, wouldn't have had children. The ripple effects extend through generations. If you're American, British, Canadian or French, and your grandparents or great-grandparents lived through World War II, there's a chance you wouldn't exist in the alternate timeline, because somewhere in your family tree, someone's life would have gone differently if D-Day had failed. But beyond the genealogical implications, think about what it means for our values and worldview. In our timeline, we take certain things for granted. That democracy is better than fascism, that racial equality is a moral imperative, that genocide is the ultimate evil. These aren't just abstract principles. They're conclusions we drew from the experience of World War II and the defeat of Nazism. In a world where Nazism wasn't decisively defeated, these principles would be contested. You'd have a major European power arguing that racial hierarchy is natural and democracy is weak. You'd have intellectuals and politicians around the world taking these arguments seriously because they come from a powerful state that has survived and perhaps thrived. The alternate timeline we're exploring is one where the moral progress of the 20th century is stunted or reversed, where the hard-won lessons about human rights, tolerance and democracy are forgotten or never learned, where the darkest ideologies of modernity aren't consigned to the ash heap of history, but remain part of the living political landscape. It's a timeline where our grandparents might have lived under Nazi occupation, where our parents might have grown up learning to accept fascism as normal, where we ourselves might speak German, not as a second language, but as the language imposed by conquerors. And yet, incredibly, this nightmare was a real possibility. D-Day could have failed. If the weather had been worse, if German intelligence had been better, if Rommel had been at his post, if any number of small factors had been different, the invasion would have been crushed. The soldiers who stormed those beaches knew the odds were terrible. They went anyway, not because they were guaranteed to succeed, but because they believed the cause was worth dying for. And they succeeded, barely, changing the course of human history. When you think about it that way, our entire world, everything we take for granted about freedom, democracy and human rights, rests on the courage of those men who waded through the surf under machine gun fire on June 6, 1944. If they had faltered, if they had been pushed back into the sea, you and I might be living in a world we wouldn't recognize, a world we would find morally repugnant. Or more likely, we wouldn't exist at all, replaced by other people living in that darker timeline, people who might not even realize how different things could have been. The failure of D-Day would have been more than a military defeat. It would have been a pivot point in human history, the moment when the arc of the 20th century bent not toward justice, but toward continued darkness. Every additional day that Nazi Germany survived was a day of suffering for millions, a day of death camps operating, a day of oppression and brutality. The success of D-Day, for all the lives it cost, ultimately saved countless more lives by bringing the war to a swifter end, and ensuring that Nazi ideology would be defeated and discredited rather than allowed to persist. So when we ask what would have happened if D-Day had failed, we're really asking, what is the value of that victory? What did those soldiers who died on the beaches actually accomplish? And the answer is, they accomplished everything. They made our world possible. They ensured that you and I could live in freedom, debate ideas openly, and take for granted the basic dignity and rights that their sacrifice secured. The alternate timeline we've explored isn't just a thought experiment. It's a reminder of how fortunate we are and how fragile that fortune is. History could have gone so differently, and it nearly did. We live on the right side of a divergence point, in the better timeline, and we have those soldiers to thank for it. Now I want to hear from you. What aspect of this alternate history disturbs you most? Do you think the Allies would have tried another invasion, or would the war have ended differently? What do you think life in 2026 would really be like if Nazi Germany had survived World War II? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.